read the short note that was sent out in the program, but I'm just going to go over not essentially A-Tree's stand or my stand, but broadly the issue out there on with reference to planting trees. Just so that I don't miss, I'm going to just read out from my notes. The cafe conversation is to get a broader perspective of how the larger community perceives about tree plantation, not just about we as researchers, academicians, and practitioners, who at times have our own soft corners, bounded by science and perception of nature, and obligation towards restoring the so-called depleted environment. And it's all towards restoring the depleted environment. It's a conversation where we find ways we can agree to disagree and see the multiple and plural views of whether planting in general is a desirable thing, including questions of where, why, and which species. So tree planting is nothing new to humanity. Ever since we have transformed the landscapes from natural forests to agriculture and wanting to reverse the damage we have created as part of developmental goals and aspirations, either because we have slowly started to recognize small and large-scale interventions such as tree planting may solve some of the ecological and environmental problems that we have created, or we are doing it because it sets a positive vibe about our passion for nature. There could be many reasons. During pre-colonial periods, heads of royal families planted trees as gesture to protect and increase the extent of forests because they were into game hunting. Then later on, during the British time, massive tree plantation happened primarily purely because of their interest in timber, not so much about forests or nature. So in the last couple of decades, so-called large-scale tree plantation programs, including the one that is touted by the Prime Minister's office under the climate change program, NAPCC, National Action Plan for Climate Change, which also has this Green India mission, which is about greening large tracts of wasteland or grasslands. They also include in that. They don't seem to see grasslands as natural forests. And one of the funniest things is like even the corporate sector seems to see tree plantation in a very different way. Just to quote, recently in one of the meetings, World Economic Forum, they made a statement saying that who's against the trees? Everyone's for trees. It's easy to understand why these trees are important because they store masses of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They give us oxygen. We breathe, and then they are really the most amazing ecosystems. Therefore, there should be no dispute that it's a good thing. We have thousands of crores of rupees that government and CSR invests annually in India on tree plantation. And again, for the fun of it, I mean, I don't know how many of you are like avid YouTubers. There is this one YouTuber, you probably know, Mr. Beast. This guy is has millions and millions of views for his. So he pledged his own money, some millions of dollars, to have 20 million trees planted on a single day in the US. That's the extent of madness certain folks have. And followed by, the US government also has pledged that they would be planting recently after the new president took over, they said they'll plant 1 trillion trees in the next 5 years in the US. Without recognizing that we lose about 10 billion trees every year globally because of deforestation, forest fires, and stuff like that. Probably most of you are also aware that China's effort of converting deserts to green forests is admired world over, and India also uses that example to have massive tree plantation in India as well. And recently the tone has changed to trying to say that tree plantation will take care of the global warming problems, climate change problems posed by global warming, which is also something that I would like experts to throw a little bit light upon. So now on to the experts. I'll start with take on.
Actually, I could not understand the most part of what he was reading out. There was some problem, I think. But broadly, what I understand is: are we for the trees or are we against the trees? Or should we have some kind of understanding where we're going to plant, what we're going to plant, and how we're going to plant? So I'll speak from the perspective of the forest department. That you've been hearing about these 5 million trees a day, 10 million trees a day, all those kind of mega events going on. Maharashtra, Haryana, UP, and then they are advertised very highly in all the Indian newspapers that we're going to go on a million tree planting programs. But there are 2, 3 aspects of this. I mean, most of the trees which they plant don't survive. I mean, everybody knows that. Most of these programs are for the PR sake. So a lot of people come together, they unscientifically do some planting, and next day nobody cares about it. But again, there's a flip side to that also. Although the plants may not survive, and it is more of a PR program, but at least people come together. There is a message passed that trees are important. People associate themselves with this kind of program. Just like recently you had this Har Ghar Tiranga program. I mean, everybody is patriotic. You don't need to actually plant a flag in your house to show that you are patriotic, but it's a message. It's kind of a mass program where you pledge yourself for the country. So these tree planting programs also a kind of more of a PR program where you pass a message to the public that trees are important. All the trees may not survive because Durgesh is here and all of us are here. Planting a trees and ensuring that it survives requires a lot of hard work, a lot of attention. So, I mean, as we go further in the discussion, we'll talk more about it. So, I would like to say that it's not a very black and white kind of scenario that we should plant or you should not plant. We should know where to plant, where, and how. That's very important.
Thanks, Deepika. I think that was wonderful. So it all depends on the context, right? Because the question should not be whether to plant or not, but how, where, and why. The why is very important. So, for example, I represent Setris, and at Setris, for some reason, is synonymous with a different kind of forestry technique, that's Miyawaki method. But let me clarify this on this forum because we have quite a wide audience representing the environment sector broadly. Of the total work that we do, about 1% or less than 1% is what we do through the high density forestry or Miyawaki method. But just that it's quite new, a lot of people lap it up immediately and they're quite fascinated by it, right? So they associate Setris with that, but we do a wide range of other things in terms of forestry also. So for example, if you ask me a question whether to plant a tree on a farmland, answer should be yes. If it is solving a lot of livelihood issues for a small and marginal farmer, then why should we not, right? Then next question is what kind of tree should be planted, right? Now, only one variable should not dictate the kind of trees that should be planted. You need to look at the local ecosystem, the soil conditions, the weather conditions, the prevailing rainfall patterns in the region, and then the market drivers of the, for the sector. Like, I'll give you an example. There are a certain set of farmers who have been growing mangoes for about 10 years now. In the last harvesting season, they lost most of the production because of the weather-related events. The increase in the heat led to the poor quality of the pulp. Now they're migrating all of them en masse to plantation of guava-based saplings and guava-based forestry. And the point is, how do we decide what to plant, when to plant, where to plant, and then why to plant, right? Similarly, I was talking to somebody outside this hall, and I said we plant saplings on scrub forest also in some places. If you look at our landscapes in Chikballapur district, we work with wide range of village institutions where saplings are planted in close consultation with the local community and the ecologists to provide them better opportunities in terms of natural resources, NTFPs, firewood, fuel wood from the commons. Now, while you're working on the commons, we have to ensure that we do not convert the commons into woodland, right? Because they are not essentially that. So, and we'll discuss all of this a little later on this, the kind of plantations we are doing. We are conducting different kind of studies with some premier research institutes to ensure that whatever is being done rightly, and the course correction is done as and when we receive any recommendations from the experts and scientists. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. I think you've both covered a number of points, and so probably there'll be a little bit of overlap between the other speakers and myself. But I want to start by making the distinction based on what Durgesh just said, that we might want to really, when we think about planting trees, first break it down into two things. Are we talking about planting trees in natural ecosystems? Or are we talking about planting trees in agricultural ecosystems for the purpose of agroforestry? And it should be very clear in your mind that these are two very different conditions for tree planting, and what works in both should be really different, okay? So that's really just about the context under which you're planting trees. But I want to also back up to that to a bigger global issue surrounding tree planting today. Today, everything that we talked about, planting 1 billion trees, planting 1 trillion trees, all of this has to do with the argument that by planting trees, we are growing our buffer against an Earth that has run away with increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so trees, which soak up the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and fix it into the biosphere, are in fact, no doubt, our biggest buffer against runaway climate change. So that part of it is true. However, there is a huge fallacy that is being promoted within the tree planting campaigns globally, which is that tree planting is actually a solution that will help us to stop climate change. So the first point I want to make is that that is absolutely not true. While tree planting may help us to soak up some of the CO2 that we have been recklessly putting into the atmosphere, the real story for climate change has to do with our exorbitant use of fossil fuels. And so let not the story or the focus on tree planting take away from the fundamental point that if you want to fight global change and what we've done with it, we need to cut down the use of fossil fuels. And no amount of tree planting on all of Earth is going to make up for that, okay? So I just want to be very clear about that. Yeah. So global warming and all the issues that we have to do with it have to do with us in the age of fossil fuels. Tree planting is one of many potential solutions, but it would be a mistake to think that just by planting trees, we can continue behaving the way we do and have the lifestyles that we do in terms of the way we consume fossil fuels. So just I want to put that out there as the single biggest thing that we need to bear in our minds, okay? That being said, let me come back to the actual brass tacks of tree planting itself. And I'm going to focus today, because I'm an ecologist, I'm going to focus on the kind of tree planting that we want to talk about doing in natural ecosystems, okay? And here the point is, of course, a tree is a very romantic thing. All of us love a tree. Many species of animals, birds, plants, and insects love trees. Trees are fantastic things. But never in Earth's history was all of Earth covered with trees. Earth has always had beautiful open ecosystems, the tundra, the grassland, the savanna. And as romantic as a tree is, it is equally romantic to see an ecosystem where from north to south and east to west, you can see the sky, and you can feel the wind, and you can see every animal from where you are to the horizon. These are the beautiful ecosystems in which our species got up and learned to walk. So although we romanticize the forest, the savanna has always occupied a large part of Earth's surface. The savannas, grasslands, and the deserts. And the problem with tree planting campaigns of today is that when we talk about tree planting as a solution for climate change, we don't keep that nuance in the discussion. And that nuance is that you want to plant trees in the ecosystems that naturally support them. And in ecosystems, because in those ecosystems, sometimes planting a tree or planting it up with multiple trees can in fact have negative effects So maybe they'll sequester a little carbon above ground, but you may start to lose below ground carbon, you may lose hydrological services, and you may lose biodiversity. This is not true when you plant the right trees in the right ecosystems. So, bottom line, if it's a degraded forest, if it's a forest from which trees have been removed over time and we want to restore them, absolutely, let's plant the trees. If we're talking about putting trees in urban ecosystems, which are today so transformed and occupy such a huge part of Earth, there's no way of going back to what they were originally. Fine, let's plant trees in urban ecosystems. Let's do it. In farmlands and agro-ecosystems, we may want to have a more nuanced approach where, depending on whether the farmer is an agroforester or whether he's simply planting the tree along a hedge of whereas most of his farmland is really cereal, you may want to think about what kind of trees you plant there. Okay? So that's my sort of slightly long take on tree planting. And the reason I wanted to keep it long is, guys, it's not simple. It is simply not as simple as plant trees or don't plant trees. This is a very nuanced business. And each of us, I think, has the responsibility to engage with it with a lot of thoughtfulness. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, panelists. I think you guys have completely brought out points that are quite important. And Jayashree summarized rightly about the role of what kind of trees where, what species, whether they are like degraded forests or forests that don't have trees anymore, they have been removed. So quickly, I have a few quick questions, or maybe not so much questions, but issues that are related to tree planting. Well, Jayashree, you did clarify that no amount of planting is going to reverse the climate change impacts of the fossil fuel usage. But there are arguments about how it could help reduce the impact, which is true. But the emphasis is not so much on saving existing trees, which is a bigger problem. I'm not so sure in terms of numbers, what is the proportion of trees that are removed versus the number of trees that are planted. Where they're planted is a very different issue, but even very plain, simple terms, I'm not so sure about the numbers. I think the degradation is still much greater than the plantation. That would be my guess. Would you like to say something now about state's effort in protecting forests versus the effort that goes into planting forests? I mean, our focus, where should we focus on, more on?
So again, I'll speak from the Forest Department's perspective. So, I joined the Forest Department in Karnataka in the year 2012. And now it's 2022, so 10 years, I've also come a very long way. I mean, the kind of views I had about forestry then and the kind of views about forestry I have now has changed hugely. Because we also learn from the scientists, we look at their publications, and we relook at what we have done all these years. So we speak to some old school foresters, and we speak to some new school foresters, and we learn a lot. So if you look at, I was in Bangalore for almost 3.5 years as a Deputy Conservator of Forest from 2016. So what I realized was most of the forests in Bangalore are more about eucalyptus and acacia. You would not find any other tree in any of the forest patch except acacia, which is, it has a turnabout period. Turnabout means when you harvest them, it has a roundabout period for around just 8-10 years. And it's basically for fuel wood and pulp, which goes to the paper factories. And then you have eucalyptus. Again, eucalyptus also used to be, harvested for the pulpwood and for the small timber. So all of the forest, from Turahalli or, Machohalli, all these forests are basically eucalyptus. So, a lot of people found faults with it, and we used to be in the line of the public backlash. Most of the public representatives spoke against it, saying that, the water table goes down hugely if you plant eucalyptus. Although there were a lot of papers published later on, a lot of scientific studies done where they say that eucalyptus is not the reason for the water table going down. What happened was, in the recent decades, we started giving very high subsidy to the farmers almost the electricity was free for them. So they used to harvest water, recklessly. So that was one of the reasons why the water table went down, especially in the belt of Kolar, Tumkur. That was what was done. And another, positive thing that I took from this, why there was eucalyptus and acacia in the forest. I mean, if these trees had not been planted, we would not have had any forest left, at least in the urban ecosystems. I mean, that's what the kind of pressure that we were facing for protecting small patches of forest land. These eucalyptus and acacia trees actually came as a blessing. Those days, I mean, judging someone what they did 30, 40, 50 years back, 70 years back, in that kind of political pressure, in that kind of, now we have Supreme Court. I mean, one activist filing one PIL, immediately the court comes in and, protects us. Imagine a scenario 50 years back, 40 years back, when we were, we had just attained independence. There was something called Grow More Food program, where a lot of forests were denotified and given to the farmers because we were facing a huge food crisis then. So a lot of forests were converted into agricultural fields. So in that context, when your country is going through a food crisis and all that you think about is how to give food to the masses, you cannot say that I would like to have forest. They're like, to hell with your forest. First, we would like to have agriculture. So a lot of those patches then were planted massively with eucalyptus. You go to Kolar, Tumkur, you go to Bandipur, you go to Nagarhole, everywhere you find either teak or eucalyptus or acacia. And these are all, NTFV-based timbers. Because if you look at the forest policy also, we gradually, during the British time and when we just attained independence, there was something called production forestry, that we grow only what we can harvest. There was nothing called ecological value, biodiversity, animals, keystone species, all that was, confined to the books. We will grow only those that we can harvest. And then we were having a, very ambitious industrial programs. We wanted railway sleepers, we wanted ships, we wanted a lot of these timbers. So that's where, we had mass planting program of teak and acacia and eucalyptus. But now we have changed. Now Forest Department also has taken, even our forestry policy now speaks of, ecological forestry. We speak about conservation forestry. So we are moving away from there. I mean, these trees were there so we could protect the forest. I mean, I have evicted a lot of lands in Bangalore then, and I can tell you it's hell of a exercise. Even to protect 2 acres of forest, you do not know the kind of drama we have to undergo. Because although, the kind of consciousness in an urban class and the kind of consciousness in rural class is very different. I mean, right now I'm working in Gadag, which is, doesn't have any factory, any industry. And then I worked in Bangalore. So I have seen the kind of mindset people have here and have in Gadag. So it takes we have, as a department, as a government department, we have a long way to go to protect our forest. I mean, we could have thought about planting these mixed species, protecting the grasslands. I mean, if you go to Gadag and Koppal, they're all grassland. They're all open scrub forest. Beautiful. I mean, like Dr. Jayashi said, I mean, I have myself seen black buck running across my forest. We have seen hyena, we have seen foxes, jackals, wolves. You cannot even imagine. People who are so romanticized with the sight of tiger, once you come to this open scrub forest, you will forget tiger and lion. You'll be so amazed with these kind of animals. So that's how it is. I mean, ever since I have moved out of Bangalore, I'm totally in love with North Karnataka. I don't want to come back to this belt at all. So, I mean, you have this kind of beautiful forest, but we have huge pressure. I mean, I'll give you an example. On paper, I have got 34,000 hectare forest in Gadag, on paper. But more than 10,000 hectares are encroached. And we cannot get them back because, you have people, it's their land, most of them are landless, most of them are tribals, scheduled caste. Then you have vote bank politics associated with that. There are en masse vote banks to the politicians there. You cannot go and tell them that, I want my forest back. To hell with you. You can be landless, I don't care. So we are a developing economy now. We still have to look at the concerns. So like Madam Jayashi said that, Forest Department per se, we have changed our perspective. Now we have, we are designing policies where we will plant and where we will not plant. And if we are going to plant, what kind of species are we going to plant? So basically now we have begun to go for a kind of initiative where we actually fence the area. I mean, there are a lot of argument against fencing also. Open scrub forest, you have animals which are actually running across. You cannot fence those forest area. I mean, there are a lot of other things also. But we have begun with fencing those areas, and we don't do any planting inside. We are just going for, protection of whatever root stock is there. And believe me, we are having amazing, it's called restocking of the forest. It's happening amazingly. So we have also, department also has come a long way. If we can have policies where forest can become no-go areas, no encroachment, no tolerance for encroachment, then we can definitely go by a very strict ecological sense of planting. But I'll tell you, if I evict certain patch of forest, and if I don't plant them within a month, I will lose double the area that I actually evicted. To protect the forest, I have to go for planting, and I have to plant something which is rapidly growing plants. So we have to go for acacia or this random kind of species. No, we are planting endemic. So what happens is we plant endemic, but we know they will not grow there. But just for the people's perspective that this piece of land has been taken back by the forest department, we have to do some planting, although we should not be planting. So now we have gone for strip planting, where we only do planting in the areas in the strip where we have evicted, and the rest of the area is just left as it is to regrow. So these are the kind of challenges we face, and maybe we'll speak more as we interact.
Thank you, Deepika. But I have known Deepika for almost 7-8 years now, and she was the DCF Bangalore Urban. And one of the fascinating things about talking to any kind of forest officer, and especially in Karnataka, because that's where I have been working for quite some time, is these real stories from the field that you get to hear. So thanks, Deepika, for sharing the practical challenges that the forest officers practice. It's not as easy, right? You remove an encroachment and then there's a threat to your life as well. Threat to your job, threat to your life and whatnot. So thank you for doing all of that, for protecting the existing forest. So the question was whether we have some data around the kind of forest clearing we see vis-a-vis the afforestation that is done. So I don't think so we have data transparency to that effect where we could actually calculate, but there are obviously random numbers that we see. Some 3-foot wall field worth of forest is being cleared across the, if you look at the global deforestation rate every minute or every second. There's some data on it, but there is no practical number around it. And similarly, if you look at different, as Deepika also spoke in the initial chat, that different government entities also, state governments particularly, take up huge targets, particularly around the World Environment Day. Right? Crores and crores of trees are planted, and we know practically it is not possible to maintain them. Right? So we do not really know whether the mega-scale afforestation activities or reforestation activities that are being done anywhere on this planet, not just in India or any one particular state, whether they get translated into trees. If yes, then to what effect? What is the percentage survival rate? Whether they are being meticulously maintained at least for 2 to 3 years, 4 years, such that they can withstand the vagaries of weather and they can be saved from the mortality that could be the eventual outcome in case you leave them to gods. Right? So yeah, so in a nutshell, we don't really have a data, but if we can plant at scale, if we can plant and maintain, and when I'm saying this is on the basis of assumption that we are taking care of all the things that Dr. Jayashree and Deepika said at the Forest Department was taking care of the policy aspects of it. Having all of those in place, if we can plant and maintain them, nurture them in terms of pruning, de-weeding, adding extra manure, watering, etc., and fencing most importantly, because loss of saplings is more because of human intervention and less because of local animals as we usually perceive. And this is from the practitioner's perspective. We have seen in Bangalore city, we have started planting saplings on lakes. We used to work with, very closely with the BBMP. BBMP would rejuvenate lakes. Cities would collaborate with BBMP, and then we would consult forest department, the BBMP's forest cell, to understand what can be planted and what cannot be planted. We mobilize volunteers, and then we go ahead and plant, and then nurture each and every sapling for at least 2 years. And on any lake, and I can probably say that we've planted on about 35 lakes in last 8 to 10 years. But survival rate on urban lakes in Bangalore is more than 95%. Reason is we go to these lakes with our set of volunteers every weekend without fail. If it is raining, obviously we'll not go, but otherwise, every weekend we will go, water these saplings, add some manure, remove the weed if there is any. If there are pest and disease-related issues on these saplings, then we would address them as well, and which led to a massive survival rate, especially on these areas. But what we also saw that people literally break these saplings. The stem of these saplings that you see, they're broken down. Now, animals, either they would chew the soft stem or they would chew on the leaves, but they would never break a stem like that. So you could evidently see that humans are the biggest threat to success or, for a successful afforestation or reforestation activity. Yeah, thanks.
I'm wondering what more to say. I think, should we open it up to the audience for questions already, or? I just wanted to make one point, which perhaps I didn't make as clearly last time, which is that I think what's becoming clear from the conversations of all the panelists is that, you know, we plant trees for different purposes under different conditions, right? And so I think it's really important for everybody who's engaging in this exercise, before they begin whatever it is that they're doing, to be very clear about, you know, what is the reason for which you are planting that given tree or that set of trees in that place in that moment of time. And I think that because we know that different trees are different in different ecosystems, and you know, the tree that belongs naturally in a grassland or a dry forest or a wet forest is fundamentally different. I think one thing that we could always have in the back of our minds when we are doing our tree planting is to take our focus away from the tree, but to ask ourselves always, what is the ecosystem in which I am? And if that is the blueprint from which you think about your tree planting, you might make very different decisions than if you just say, I have to plant 100 trees. So I think it's really important to make that change of perspective, to scale up from saying, I'm planting trees, to saying, I am restoring this ecosystem, which is what belongs here. And I think that could really solve a lot of the mistakes that we make when we do tree planting.
Thanks. If I could push the panelists a little bit more on this particular question. For example, I mean, obviously, planting trees in biomes which are ecologically inappropriate is something that probably most of us agree. But if I could push you a little bit more on why the state and the civil society are not working towards protecting the existing forest, because that's a question that nobody seems to ask. It's more about adding the biomass into the forest as against like protecting the existing biomass. That's something that I have always wondered why the state is not. Of course, obviously, except for the protected areas, most other areas are open to harvesting and stuff. But what can be done outside the protected areas as well?
I don't really have a very clear-cut answer to this question, so I may want to skip this one.
So, I mean, why not the state not protecting forest? I mean, that
No,
question.
I'm not asking the state, but what could be done? Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean,
So-
protected area, the Wildlife Protection Act does provide that.
No, see, I mean,
protection
if we
to-
speak technically and statutorily, protected areas are strictly wildlife areas.
Yes.
If you look at protected areas, statutorily, they are only wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, and conservation reserves. If you look at forests, then they are everything. I mean, see, the conversation can go endlessly. So what happens is how do we protect forest? I mean, for a state to protect forest, we first need to enforce the law. And to enforce law, we need to have that forest categorized so-and-so under so-and-so act. So we have something called reserve forest, protected forest, minor forest, this forest, that forest, and all that. and the severity of penalties differ from the different forest and all that. Yeah, deemed forest and all that. The Supreme Court keeps coming in and, they keep giving new definitions. Thank God. That's why we have got the forest left. So in fact, you'd be very amazed that we have got, technically, statutorily, we have got 11,000 hectares of forest in Bangalore, but we have got 11,000 hectares of forest as deemed forest, which are not categorized under any law. So you have equal area of forest which are not categorized under any statutorily protected forest. So forest department, if you say state, is doing all they can to protect this forest, but challenges are huge, like I said earlier also. In fact, they are only getting worse. And I would blame a lot of it to the competitive political environment all around. Because you have a huge, huge vote bank, and you would never give away that vote bank for the sake of forest. So what we are facing now on the ground is a misinformed public. I would not, bring the Bangalorean class in the definition of public. You people are very different. I am talking about from the rural perspective. So, there's something called FRA, Forest Rights Act. Now, I don't know if I'm going to give very controversial statements here. So there's a lot of empathy and compassion around this act, that we should be giving a lot of land rights to the scheduled forest tribes and the OTFD and all that. But that's not the case on the ground. This single act has been misused and abused, I don't know to what level. So anybody who files an application, there is an encroacher on the ground, and he just files an application saying that I was cultivating so-and-so land from 100 years, 30 years, 50 years, whatever. There's no document to prove that. But just because he is given an application, it becomes pending under the Forest Rights Act. Because you have submitted an application, it becomes a pending application. Now you cannot take any action against him. Then there's something called rejected forest rights claim. Somebody claims that I was cultivating so-and-so forest patch, it's rejected in all the level of committees, Gram Sabha, village, whatever. Then what happens is there's a PIL filed in the Supreme Court which says, what about those rejected applicants? Okay, you have given patta and ownership to the people who actually qualified under the Act. What about these threefold people who have been rejected under the Act? So Supreme Court says that, they will have to be evicted. Then civil society goes to the Supreme Court and files in PIL that no, you cannot evict them. We should review those applications. So Supreme Court comes again and says that you review those applications because there were mass rejections by the authorities and they have not applied their mind. So again, those entire process is repeated. And then, when certain processes get reviewed, that means there'll be more stakeholders which come into picture. So if there was BJP during the first review, you'll have Congress during the second review. They will have their own vote bank, they will have their own vote bank. So that happens, then review process gets entangled for years together, and then they are rejected. So first application, review, rejected. Now you cannot even evict those rejected applicants because it is pending in the Supreme Court. And then every time there is Lok Sabha session or some session, they ask, are you going to take a step to, evict these FRA rejected applicants? And then the answer is no, we have no plans to reject them. So that's one scenario. This is FRA claims. So huge amount of forest land under encroachment, but you cannot evict them. Then you have farmers. They say that we have been cultivating this so-and-so forest land, so-and-so patch of land for say 3 decades, 4 decades, 5 decades. So one day, some government will come and regularize our encroachment. So they wait for that one day. And every 5 years you have one election cycle, and so government gives them promise that when I come to power, I'll regularize your forest patta, whatever. So that is another kind of encroachment. And then you have political kind of encroachments. So there are so many issues. And of late, I don't know whether you've been reading newspapers, any forest eviction, all the staff are transferred en masse from the lower level to the higher level. Plus, you have most of these eviction cases, people who go there, not just the jurisdictional officer, but anybody, like, when you go for evictions, I don't know if it sounds very boring, but I'm just telling you the practical point of view. So when we go for evictions, we will, we usually carry a huge team. So for example, I am the DFO, I have got 5 talukas or 6 talukas under me. So I'll mobilize all the staff of all the talukas because I will require a lot of force there. And then what happens is cases under atrocities of SC/ST Act is filed against all my staff. And then once it is filed, there's a huge public uproar, I mean the local uproar there, that they should be arrested immediately and jailed. And then we have to move for anticipatory bail. I mean, one government agency working against another government agency, that's a joke. So then we have a case against us. We have to go and engage private lawyers. Thank God we have a lot of lawyers who are sensitive to our story, so they fight for us pro bono. I will tell you a story when we move ahead. So then we have to fight that case ourselves for anticipatory bail. Then we have to file a case for quashing that FIR, all by ourselves. Who has told us to go and evict these forest lands? Nobody. I don't care. I mean, I tell my people that if the government doesn't want and the people don't want, why should we go and evict these forest lands? But then we should remember that we don't work for that current government. We are working for the people. That's what I tell my staff, that we don't work for this party or this government. We work for the people. And and every other department works for today, but we are working for intergenerational assets. So I tell my staff that even 2 acres of eviction, you're protecting these for generations to come. So we are very, we are very, very true to what we should do. But these are the ground realities. So civil society, Bangalore, when I was in Bangalore, I had a huge support. That's why we could do a lot of evictions, despite the entire government sitting here. I could do a lot of evictions because I had support of civil society, I had support of RWAs, I had support of the media, and there was a lot of things. But that's not the case when we move out of Bangalore. Entire game changes. Everything becomes political. Everything becomes caste-based. Everything becomes community-based. So it's very difficult. I don't know. I mean, I feel the forests today are there because of the judiciary and nobody else. Because, we are very weak on the ground. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. I think the issue of implementation of FRA can be taken for another cafe altogether, because thank you, sir. So I have a couple of more questions, and then maybe we can open it up to the audience. One of the issues that when we speak to sociologists or political economic folks about tree plantation, about mass tree plantation, is the implication it has on livelihoods, which is something that never is debated when we talk about tree plantation. So I would like the panelists to throw a little bit of weight on the issue of impacts on livelihoods, something that is also important to understand over and above the ecological consequences.
Okay. So I want to probably begin by addressing the issue of tree planting and livelihoods in arid, semi-arid, and savanna ecosystems, which is where really it's the biggest problem. So what happens in these places is that traditionally, many of these ecosystems have supported pastoral livelihoods, which means livelihoods associated with people who herd cattle. And they require these open systems. So the first thing that happens when the state as a player goes in and plants trees without consulting local communities is that when you put trees on the land, the first very obvious thing that happens is that you've taken away grazing lands, right? And when that starts to happen at scale, you can really start to reduce access for domestic livestock, for pastoralists whose livelihoods depend on them. So there is a direct link between tree planting and livelihoods, and it is most obvious in these ecosystems. That is not to say that there's no use for such trees, right? So even people in those areas do need fuel wood and may have some use for such trees. The problem is that very often the tree planting may not be done in consultation with them, or in the areas where they are, it's okay to plant a few trees, or the idea that even if we plant some trees here, we need to restrict it. And the reason this is actually very important to consider in the context of the world as we know it today is that we know now, historically, from a lot of work in the semi-arid parts of Africa and other parts of the world, that in fact, in the semi-arid and arid regions of the world, pastoralism, especially mobile pastoralism, is one of the most sustainable and climate-friendly lifestyles. In these places, planting trees and agriculture, it's not smart. It's not climate smart, it's not livelihood smart, it is not going to be sustainable on a planet that is changing in unpredictable ways before us. Because these livelihoods and the way they evolved historically adapted to a system where the system was constantly changing. So there are constant droughts. When you have droughts, pastoralists know that many of their cattle will die. In rainy years, they follow the resources and move with it. So I'm specifically talking about mobile pastoralism that includes larger landscapes. It is actually a very sustainable lifestyle. And if we wanted to actually take those parts of the world and think about them as being sustainable for future generations, instead of planting trees there, we want to think about how to make pastoralism in these habitats economically sustainable in the long run. This is a completely different thing from tree planting. So that's one place where I see that tree planting can immediately have consequences that are not always positive for livelihoods. This is not true in other places, of course. There are many places where planting trees has actually had useful effects on livelihoods. And I think some of these examples come from towards the more mesoc end, where you've got degraded forests, and it's become a really hard job to maybe restore those forests. In many cases there, people have put in plantations, and a whole bunch of livelihoods have grown around plantations. So for example, charcoal that is made from prosopis or stuff like that. That can actually be useful. So once again, my answer is it's nuanced. And we have to, at every stage, think about how do we make a solution that works for different aspects of the problem. And I think it's always our problem is that we just try and find a simple solution when in fact none of the problems that are confronting us as a species and for our ecosystems are simple. So I think let's embrace complexity because we are a very smart species and I think we can do it. We just need to do it.
Thank you. Right, I think you've covered fairly a broader aspect around how trees may have both the kinds of impacts on livelihoods, right? And I'll sort of share a story from our practical experience on the field. Again, our area of intervention in the recent past has been around Bangalore, Kolar, Chikballapur district, where we work with the local community, the village dwellers, to understand their needs. They depend on commons for a wide range of natural resources, right? You'll have some households who have some sort of livestock who need access to grasses, but you'll also have households who do not have or do not own livestock, right? But they instead depend on the other kind of natural resources available on the commons for their livelihoods. Smallest of the examples is custard apple in the region where it's not invasive, but it's very, very widely naturally present in the ecosystem itself. It's not a tree, it's a small, I don't know whether you could categorize it as a shrub, scrub, or whatever it is. It's tiny, tiny plant, but it gives them good livelihood. Similarly, you have some trees whose leaves can be used as leaf plate, for example. Right? So adding trees in the right manner, and the ecosystems where we work on, these are largely scrub-based vegetation, right? So integrating wide range of trees across the landscape will definitely be detrimental. But I'll tell you the approach we follow. We work very closely with the communities to decide what extent of land do they want to bring under reforestation/afforestation, because some of the areas where we do, and Raj Kamal and team is studying very meticulously on some of our sites where we have the reports suggest that some of those sites were forest areas earlier, right? So in that sense, the restoration, we can also call that as a restoration because bringing back trees on the lands where trees existed couple of decades ago. So that way we decide what extent, and very broadly speaking, on any common land, right? It could be a grassland, it could be a scrub land. We ensure that we do not cover more than 8 to 10% of the land with trees, so that it is catering to the needs of herders. It also catering to the needs of households who do not own livestock, but they instead depend on trees for their livelihoods. And this is for public lands, for common lands, for lands owned by panchayat. But similarly, you can also talk about private lands, both in context of small, big, and marginal farmers. Integrating trees, I have seen, Shashank is my colleague right here, we visited Maharashtra in the October end, 2021. I happened to meet a farmer who owns about 120 acres of land. And all he does is tree-based farming, right? It's giving him good income. Now he's a big farmer. They migrated from Gujarat. They're staying at the border of Gujarat and Maharashtra, doing fantastic tree-based vegetation, zero chemical input, highly biodiverse tree-based cultivation, right? Deriving different aspects from the trees. Some of the trees, obviously, they have particularly meant for to be used as pulpwood or timber wood. But most of the trees they have planted or exist on the land is being conserved, saved. The products from those trees are being used and they are being sold in the market to get livelihood out of it. And same goes for a small farmers, a farmer who might be an agroforester. Some farmer might want to use tree as a timber, which the farmer might want to log it off after 25, 30 years. And those kind of trees then act as an insurance for the farmer in case of emergencies. Similarly, you may want to plant trees on the farmland such that you have enough space available for your crops to grow, right? Those kind of trees can give you recurring income year after year after year. But having said that, you'll also have to ensure there's some bit of diversity in terms of flora that you have on the field. Monoculture is something that should not be promoted. So it does. It may work both the ways. It may have detrimental impact on the livelihood. It may have positive impact on the livelihood depending on the context. And consultation with the beneficiary is not the right word, but the people who you're working with to solve their problems for need to be consulted and closely involved at every stage of the intervention that you're planning, right from the focus group discussion till the implementation, post-implementation stage. And if possible, if you're helping them connect with the markets to that so that their impact, overall impact of the intervention is amplified to that effect. Thank you.
So thanks, Durgesh. I mean, you pointed out a very important issue about consultation. So related to that, let me just mention both in the context of reforestation and afforestation. In the broader context of forest management, we have a JFPM, GFM, many of these participatory management programs. But when it comes to afforestation or reforestation, especially in the case of afforestation, reforestation probably is not an issue because you're just planting trees where plants existed earlier, trees existed earlier. But in afforestation programs, I don't think there is any participatory process at all, at least as much as I know, which I rightly agree that there should be. I mean, if there are going to be beneficiaries or if there are going to be people who might get affected, I mean, there are trade-offs depending upon the ecological context. So I don't know. I mean, one thing that I thought was like these examples that we have from Central America where they have these payments for ecosystem services kind of programs. I'm personally not a big fan of PS, but I mean, it has worked in some places. They have a very different rate, some few $100s for new forests that they come up in private lands, and then they also pay some money, little less than that, for maintaining existing forests. So something of that sort, not necessarily paying them in cash, but some other incentive mechanisms. I mean, how would that work, and what would be your thoughts?
No, I mean, so there are two parts to the issue that you've raised or the question that you've asked. One aspect is around the participatory approach, especially in case of afforestation. So I would not be able to speak for the state. Deepika is right here. She may want to share her practical experience in that regard. But as a civil society, we do have different kind of entities working with individuals, organizations, etc. On reforestation, and everybody has a different thought process, right? But Broadly speaking, I've met a lot of NGOs because we work in this space and we work on collaboration and partnerships. I have met NGOs which have been in this space for about 5.5, 6 decades now, and they have ensured that they have participatory approach as a strategy to ensure the longevity and effectiveness of the program on the ground. But what you said is absolutely correct. I have also met NGOs or entities, both for-profit and non-profits, who do not bother about involving local stakeholders in the decision making, and obviously which is bad. And the outcome is very, very clearly visible after the intervention is done, right? There's no straight answer to that question basically, but we'll have different kind of entities having different objectives and goals and agenda to drive on. A lot of NGOs on the field have good agenda, solving the problem in the right manner, which is where they consult with different kind of stakeholders, not just the community, but the ecologists, the botanists, the agronomists, right? And they collectively work towards finding a solution which is most feasible in the region. Obviously, as you said, trade-offs will be there, but what is more practical in the current scheme of things is something that's then designed. Now, coming to the second aspect, if you could repeat your second question around the PES and some sort of incentive.
This example is from Costa Rica, where it has actually worked both ways, both in terms of encouraging new forests and then also protecting existing forests. A similar mechanism for protecting private forests could potentially have positive benefits.
That statement may open door to a very wide discussion on payment for ecosystem services or carbon offset linked climate finance, private finance in that space. And as we speak, the government of India is currently working on setting up carbon markets in the country, and I think that will change a lot of things, how money is flowing into the afforestation/reforestation space. So it'd be too early for me to comment on that, but currently, again, I'll give you some examples. So when we work in the villages, wherever we are working on commons, we ensure that we do not deploy any machinery for, say, preparation of the soil. Right? Although I will have an option to get an auger machine or a JCB to dig the pits and expedite my work, but I'll instead wait for a month and a half for local people who are then paid for every activity that they do on the ground, for digging of the pits, for plantation, for fencing, and then we also deploy local people for protection of those saplings in the local region. So that's one thing that can be done, and I think a lot of programs are doing, especially as again, I'm sharing perspective from as a civil society or entity working with the communities, a non-state actor. That's the easiest way to engage the community. But the second way, obviously, is to look for other mechanisms where protection of the existing ecosystem can be facilitated in terms of, say, conservation of biodiversity. Because if you look at private finance flowing into this space, then you have biodiversity-linked carbon credits. You have carbon-linked, obviously, carbon credit. That's the name, carbon credit. You could also look at conservation of grasslands, which is again linked with carbon credits. So private finance, and I'm very, very hopeful that Government of India will come up with this market policy very, very soon. And it may go both the ways, but it might help in better conservation, because who doesn't love money, right? Everybody wants more money, and our savings are going down, our expenditure is going up, and extra money in hand will definitely help everybody, especially the most marginalized and the poor who thrive on commons in the natural ecosystem for their livelihoods. So we'll wait and see how it evolves. But yes, we can definitely take cue from the other successful projects that are being done elsewhere outside India. Thanks.
Thank you. Deepika, I want to add something to that? Okay. So I think we can open it up to the audience. I'll comment or a statement that is different or supporting the ones that we have already discussed here. Please don't repeat the
local issues that you are facing in the ground. So my question is, it is in India, as far as I see, there is a very large scale of land discrimination. There are a lot of people is having huge land, and there are a lot of people don't have the land at all. So is that because of the Land Reformation Act is not properly implemented on the ground during the independence time? What do you think?
I would request the audience to restrict your questions or comments to the issue that we are discussing, because there are many issues that can keep connecting with.
Okay, sorry.
implementation.
Sorry.
So, yeah, please go ahead.
So, I might make a very controversial statement. In a sense, he spoke about, why people, there are a lot of people who are landless in India, even today. There's a huge number of people who are landless. They don't even have, a small patch of land where they can actually cultivate. So why not have this land reformation? And when people are landless, how can you say that I'm going to protect thousands and thousands of hectares of forest when there are still landless people around? So social welfare is not, is not my subject. Forest department is not for social welfare. We have 50, 60 other departments who have to look for social welfare. You have to look for livelihood, you have to look for distribution land, you have to look for everything else. So we are entrusted with the protection of forest, and that's the headache of the government. I mean, there are a lot of these lands which are left fallow, which are degraded. Government has to come up with some policy to make them, arable. And government has to come up with some policy to, catch these Benami landowners and distribute them among the poor people. That is for the government to act. I have been entrusted with the duty to protect the forest, and the government has to come and say that, let's denotify this forest and let's redistribute this forest to the people who are landless. Then we are okay. You cannot have one side, you say that protect the forest, and on the other side you said, we are not going to protect you who are going to protect the forest. So that's how it is. Landless, people who are landless, who don't have land, that is the problem of the government. It's a very big issue which government has to think about it. But we as a department are supposed to protect the forest on ground, and government has to do everything to ensure that we do our duty properly.
Your question about how do we do economics and whatever wildlife, how do we develop economically and conserve nature at the same time? That's probably one of the toughest questions, which we are all grappling with all the time. And I think we all know that you can't say it's going to be one or the other, especially in a country like ours, where there are 1.3 billion people. So there's no question of saying, I'm going to conserve all this nature, but let all these people starve, or vice versa. It doesn't work, right? So we have to, I think, in terms of development, the problem is not with just development per se, but it is when we do development without absolutely thinking about building nature and natural resource conservation into it. It's not that hard. If I have a highway that is going to go through a wildlife area, I can take the time, we're not that poor a country, we're actually doing reasonably well. I can think about first ways to develop that highway so that I minimize the impact on a wildlife area. Second, if I simply cannot find such a solution, I can think about a way to engineer that highway such that it is least disruptive to that forest, right? So you can do a raised highway and have a fantastically working wildlife underpass under it. It's going to cost a little bit more today, but in the long run, it's going to pay back in terms of all the many benefits that nature conservation gives us. So once again, I think it's a question of not doing things unidimensionally, but accepting that we have to do things in a more complex way. So I'm not against development per se, and I think you can't live in India and say I'm against development. It's really hard to say that. My conscience would have a trouble with that. But I'm saying I want to do it in ways that are ecologically sustainable, that are wildlife and nature friendly. And I do not think the two are inimical to each other. It requires a little bit creativity. Look, we've got the 16 IITs. I actually believe some of our best solutions as we go forward are going to come from engineers and ecologists working together, from folks from the forest department and scientists like us working together. And that's another thing as a culture we need to do. We need to work collaboratively. We don't do that. Everybody's doing their own thing. I mean, that is foolish in a world that is increasingly connected, not just at the local scale, but at national and global scales. So I think we have to just change our mindsets on these very fundamental things. But I genuinely believe that we have all the smarts to do it right. And I can imagine, especially for the next generation, they will have the mantle to do it. But if they do it and they leave behind an earth that's working and everybody has a great life, wow, brilliant. I dream of it.
Maharashtra to Bangalore, Bandipur, and working with the forest department also to give you all solutions to Lantana, give you all solutions to this. This thing was, I think, are we going to plant trees or are we not going to plant trees? I think this was just the topic. Should we plant or should we not plant? Fantastic that we have gone all over the place on talking on so many different topics. But yes, we should plant trees because we are losing 16 to 18 million hectares of forest every year. That has come down from 2017-18 down to 10 million hectares now. We are still losing 10 million hectares. But we should plant in those things. We don't need to go and plant somewhere all over the place. You go and plant and restore those 10 million hectares first. That is a gigantic task. And for that, as she said very correctly, you need government will. You need no corruption. You do not need people हड़पिंग. हम महाराष्ट्र में बोलते हैं जमीन हड़प करते हैं. फार्मर बैठ जाता है उधर, ये मेरा जमीन है, मेरा grandfather. You need that kind of thing. I agree very much with what she has been saying. You need that. And as far as your urban goes, I am part of the heat island mitigation group worldwide. I'm also one of the founders of the Indian Green Building Council. So when we conducted heat island mitigation experiment here in India, we found that trees certainly are a heat island mitigation tool. It is certainly a carbon sink. But when you are concretizing your Bangalore, in 93 when I came to Bangalore, I wore 2 sweaters. Today I can't wear even a single sweater. You have concretized everything, you have cut everything, you need to restore that. It's so simple. You do rooftop gardening, you do whatever, but you need to restore that balance. So planting is a must. There's no question about it.
Thank you. I mean, I don't think there is any question about planting in cities, which is definitely has positive impacts, both in terms of temperature reduction. It's not, yeah, exactly. It's a no-brainer.
I'll just stick to nuance here. But trees teach us about relationships, and especially when we apply design principles in nature with urban housing, we can sequester carbon, we can have less electricity needs, we can plant in tandem with the sun so that we can protect ourselves from summer, high solar arcs and azimuths. So that way, and they have, I think, principally, wherever you are in what context, the tree and what function it serves is dependent on what your need is.
Thank you. I think we're running out of time.
One which I don't know whom to ask in particular, but I'll ask it anyway. The thing is that if you look at formations in nature, the physiognomic formations in nature, you will find taller forests and valleys and hilltop grasslands, giving us insights onto the mechanism of things.
Thank you. I mean, the question is interesting because when you pose it as we, you're talking as if it's like one person's, because the we has multiple we's in there.
I don't want to say you, I could have said, why is your forest department doing it?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. You have a last.
One last comment. One comment that I just want to make, and this is on behalf of Dr. Bajpai, Deepika, but Deepika, IFS, how do I say?
Deepika.
Okay, of Deepika and folks from the Forest Department and folks from the IFS and IIS, I just want to say that I really appreciate that your job is incredibly difficult. I really do. Science is technical. I'm a scientist. I love doing science. I love it because it's so challenging. But you know what? All of the solutions, it's just up to us to find the problem. But you guys have a really tough time because you're given huge mandates and so much is out of your control. And I know that every single day your job is incredibly challenging. And so hats off to all of you who do it. I just want to say that.
Thank you. We are running out of time. Thanks, audience.